We're really excited today to have our guest speaker, Tim, who Vivian will be introducing in a minute. But my name is Elizabeth Janice Pearl, and I'm the Alumni Director here at UCEAP. Bryn, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, my name is Bryn Lemon. I'm the Scholarships and Alumni Engagement Coordinator in our office in Goleta, and I'll be running our technical side today. So if you have any difficulty getting access, please let me know. And we'll go ahead and let Vivian introduce Tim.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Vivian Nitre. I'm the Associate Vice Provost and Executive Director of UCEAP. And I was on the UCR faculty for many years, and I was a Study Center Director in the Netherlands. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce to everybody Timothy McClanahan, who is a biologist, a conservation zoologist, and director of the Wildlife Conservation Society's Coral Reefs program for Eastern Africa. The Wildlife Conservation Society is a non-governmental organization. It's headquartered at the Bronx Zoo in New York City. It happens that I was born in the Bronx, so I am enjoying this connection, however superficial and tenuous, to Tim and his work. Tim graduated from the Department of Biology at Santa Cruz in 1981. And his PhD was earned at the University of Florida in 1990. Thereafter, he started his work as a conservation zoologist, initially at the Coral Reefs Conservation Project, and then later under the Wildlife Conservation Society, where he still is, I believe, a senior conservation zoologist based in Mombasa, Kenya. His research there focuses on the marine tropical ecosystems of the Western Indian Ocean. And he pays particular attention to the ecology of coral reefs, which, have been in the news a great deal in recent years because of climate change. Tim is an editorial board member of a number of prestigious journals, and he's been the recipient of multiple grants and awards. We're really honored to number Tim among UCEAP's alumni, and I know that we all look forward to learning more about his life and work. So, Tim, welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Vivian. And thank you for having me here and reconnecting me to this community. I'd sort of lost track of it. I've lived in Kenya for a very long time, continuously since 1991. And so I graduated from Santa Cruz in 81 and was in Nairobi in 1978 and 1979. So I just wanted to throw this picture up to remind you I was very precocious when I went there in 1978, and that's why I don't look so old these days. Yeah. No, I put this picture up there because I like this picture of myself, and it reminds me of a few things about internationalism and travel. And this is a picture of me, I think in 1961 in France. My father was stationed in France. He was ROTC doctor and stationed in France post-war. And so I was born in the US, but my brothers and sisters, a number of them were born in France. And that's me, and probably about 4 years old. And so a lot of my early experience was actually in another country. I went to a Catholic nuns, kindergarten or primary school. I spoke French as an early child, probably not very well, and I just got used to the fact that maybe at an early age that we didn't all look at the world in the same way. And I think that's kind of embodied my personality for quite some time, that there's a diversity of people, languages, and cultures out there. And the other thing probably you can't quite tell from this picture, but I know, is that this is typical me. I'm eating an apple and I'm heading out. And my mother insists on taking a picture of me. And I'm prepared to go out on an adventure, which is typical of me, is that we lived on an army base, which is a very uninteresting place, but I managed to go out and find snails and bugs and ants and beetles and put them in my pocket. And I became sort of an early naturalist, even at this age, fascinated by the natural world. And I managed to do it in an environment that wasn't that biologically diverse. And probably because I lived on an army base, I was aware of how undiverse it could be in terms of both socially and biologically. So I've always spent a lot of my time doing this, being kind of stubborn and preparing myself to get out in the field, wearing what I want. And that's probably why when I thought about going on the Education Abroad program, I decided I wanted to go somewhere very different. Where was the most different place that I could go? And I sort of I had lived in France as a child, and my family, I would say, were Europhiles. But I thought, no, I have to do something completely different. I think at that point I spoke English, French, and Spanish. And I wanted to learn a non-Romance language. And I decided Swahili was the language I would learn. So I took the bus to UC Berkeley Library looking for a Swahili book to teach myself Swahili. And I found a little teach yourself book and started to learn Swahili, which was not an easy undertaking. If you know anything about Swahili, there's no connection to European languages. It has 7 noun classes and singular and plural, etc. So, but I decided that was one of the things I would do. And the other thing to remember, this in 1978, 79, at least for somebody like me, was that this is a post-60s period. Many of us coming to age were raised in the 60s. People like me who are interested in the environment, we had read books at that time in high school. I was a precocious reader, so I read from an early age. But the ecology movement in what was it, Earth Day in 1970, 72, I think it was. There's some books that came out, The Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich in 1970, which is now 50 years old. The Club of Rome book, The Limits to Growth by the Meadows. And as a person reading in high school at those ages, those were very influential books to me. And even more so when I went to the UC system, that idea that, the human population bomb, the environmental problems. And although I came from a family of medical people, I thought at that age that was a very self-centered way of looking at the world. I decided I would be an environmental or an ecologist and study nature, because that's where my concerns were at that point. And so that was sort of the time I was in Nairobi. The issues around diversity, biological diversity, the losses of biodiversity, tropical deforestation, human population growth. Kenya had a 4.5% annual growth rate in 1978. All of those things seem to me like a nexus for problems, and that maybe I could somehow get involved in those issues in Africa. And in fact, that's largely what has turned out. And many of those thoughts then are in fact things that I can continue to think about. I'm trying to change slides now. Oh, here we go. And I had one of those moments in Kenya, or years in Kenya, where I met my wife, Nyawira, shown on the picture on the left, where I had one of those meetings with a person that I immediately got along with. And we started conversations that have not stopped until today. And one interesting thing about Nyawira was that she wanted to be a marine biologist. That's her at 20, and she was very clear that she was going to be a marine biologist. And I was interested in environmental issues, and she was a very unusual person in that sense, because in Africa, women didn't swim in general. I mean, marine biology in her own ethnic group was something unheard of, things that people didn't do. So she stood out as quite a unique individual, and we've been together for 45 years now. And we've spent a life in the water. That's typical of, we're either on land or in the water. And that would be a typical picture of us doing field work together. We've been doing field work together all of those years. We've had different jobs in different places. She worked for the government for 17 years, but we always managed to work together. Anyways, the picture on the left tells you a little bit about that time. And one of the interesting things is I was very poor during that time. And Nairobi was not a bad place to be if you're poor, because you could live fairly cheaply. But one of the problems is I didn't own a camera. And this picture, I have no idea where I got it, but somebody took a picture of us and sent it to me. And I have that. And you can tell from the times, it's the 70s, the haircut gives it away. And there's some hypotheses as to that. It's the 70s. I was afraid of barbers. I had no money, one of those options, but basically that was sort of that time period that we were in. This relationship with Nyawira and with the environment has been something that's kept me focused for quite a long time, and I continue today. We've gotten we've been very productive as a couple. We've won a number of awards. This is one, we won a Banovich Award for Conservation Excellence in 2018. This is one of these competitive sort of Hollywood type awards for the environment. And we did the unusual thing of submitting an application as a couple. So I think those are the losers on the left and with the checks, and that's on the right with the trophy. And in the bottom is the man who introduced us was Charles Duke, one of the 13 men that has walked on the moon on the Apollo 16. And so we're a hard team to beat. We've been extremely productive scientifically. I think my program has published close to 300 actual journal articles in leading ecological journals. So when we do enter these things, we do pretty well in that sense. So there's a long history of production in environmental and conservation science with a focus on coral reefs. And it's hard not to love coral reefs, as you can tell from the picture at the bottom, and it's easy to get inspired by them. And there's just a lot unknown, so it's easy to be productive. If you know the literature on coral reefs, of which it's quite enormous, you can still realize there's quite a bit to learn from that. So we've done well as a couple. And so I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about what I work on. These are what East African reefs look like from the air, and a close-up, a picture I took out of a window of an airplane flying through Mozambique. And this is pretty typical here. If you look at that, that's a reef in front. And what you often notice is near these reefs, there are little villages, which are seen in the background. And in average, there's a lot of people, particularly in dry areas like Mozambique, that are highly dependent on marine resources because the land is not productive. And a lot of villages set up around these reefs. So there's this relationship between the village and the reef. And I think on average, the average fishing village is about 40 minutes from a reef. And it's almost like a refrigerator. It stores animal protein and produces food for these villages. And so that connection is really part of the human interactions in the tropics, something that we don't often appreciate. But reefs are in many ways geographic points of production in what are often poor in resource poor environments, either due to low rainfall or low nutrients, which is common to the tropics, poor soils. But reefs manage to have this pretty good productivity. It's about 5 tons per square kilometer per year if it's managed sustainably, and it manages to do that productivity in a very nutrient poor environment. And that's sort of one of the mysteries of reefs is how do they do that? And one of the ways they do that is to build these calcium carbonate skeletons, which is what you're seeing. A reef is actually the dead skeletons of a polyp or an animal that's deposited calcium carbonate, and it grows with sea level. So a lot of estimates of sea level rise and fall are actually based on these calcium carbonate platforms at what depth they're at. So 20,000 years ago, there's evidence that corals were, 100 meters below the ocean. And there's evidence for coral reefs being 5 to 10 meters above the ocean, or if you go back to the Miocene, 20 or 30 meters above the current sea level. So they give you an indicator of sea level rise, and they're therefore important sort of indicators of climate change on that very long time scale. My interest is more about the sustainability of fisheries and how to get people to manage around them, because this reef, as you see here, is what we call commons. There's nobody owns that reef. It's sort of a shared resource. And so you potentially run into the problems of commons. That is, when nobody owns something, how do you manage it effectively? It requires a certain amount of collective action in order to get that done. And that collective action is part of the socioeconomics that I find quite interesting beyond the ecology itself. So it brings together ecology, what we call human dimensions or collective action, and then it brings in issues of climate change and stuff like that. So it's a great ecosystem if you're a broad-minded or holistic investigator like myself, that you can connect to all those different issues. And most of those issues I've addressed at one point or another of my career. The other thing, of course, is biodiversity. And I think we're all aware of that. There's this amazing biodiversity, and the reasons for that, the evolutionary reasons, are intriguing enough on their own. But then also the conservation of that biodiversity. What do we require to maintain that diversity, and how can we have that diversity and feed people, have fisheries production and feed people, and get those other ecological services? Is there a trade-off there? What are the consequences of climate change, other destructive uses, the failure of collective action to manage these resources? The biodiversity is threatened, and that was part of my initial intrigue, was that this biodiversity, human population, food security, all of those things kind of had a nexus in this reef environment for me, and in particular in Africa. These are the main threats to coral reefs: climate change, watershed issues, people, coastal development, and overfishing or destructive fishing. So all of these are things that I work on. And the thing to remember, that these are all what we call commons dilemmas. There's no individual, no corporation, no government, scale of government that's really particularly, focused on this particular problem. So the commons issues are something that I think a lot about. And I think they're important to all of us, Americans or otherwise, and we don't think enough about that problem, of what it means to have a common, a shared air, a shared water, shared forest resources, shared fisheries. These are all critical issues, and really the solutions lie in solving some of the issues around these commons, the collective action problem. And they're solved or not solved in many different ways, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that. This is actually from a paper just published a month ago, where I looked at the relationships between food production, yields, and biodiversity, and it's based on the study sites in this area. So according to the people in my office, I've done about 900 sites in the Western Indian Ocean. I think what I call 300 unique sites. That's sites that are kind of close to each other that you can pool. But I've been really worked in and are collecting data in the 8 or 9 of the Western Indian Ocean countries. So I have these large data sets that allow me to sort of look at patterns on very large scales. One of the things what interested me very early on was the production in coral reefs. It was something not really known very much about. It was studied from a scientific point of view of what we call primary production, the productivity of reefs, and they were known to be quite high, but the production of fish is a more difficult problem to solve, because there are many species of fish, and they have different productivity levels. And how do you measure production? One of the things that I did over the 30 years I've been working there is I've been looking at about 13 fully protected closures, areas that were once fished and now fishing has stopped. And what I do is, on the left chart, is look at the recovery rates in those closures over time. And what it shows is basically it takes 15 to 20 years for the stocks or the biomass to level in these fisheries. And from that information, you can get a production measure. Population biologists call that the coefficient R, and K is the leveling point. But it turns out that there is a pretty consistent pattern in the region, and that productivity then allows me to estimate yields, and yields are related to food. So you can look at food as relative to the maximum possible production, which sustainably is what I mentioned before, 5 tons per kilometer squared per year. And then if you look at the biodiversity patterns, what you can see is that reefs are fairly resilient to losses in fish biomass. That's the upper right figure. But once you reduce the biomass to about 70% of its limit, the K value there, then you start to see these massive declines in biodiversity. And that's a worry. And in these reefs that I study, about 80% of them are what we call overfished. That means they're fishing beyond this maximum sustained capacity. And so they're generally losing about 6 to 15% of their biodiversity, just simply due to fishing effects. So the interesting thing, though, here is that if you do fish close to what we call maximum sustained yield, you actually get a pretty high biodiversity. So there's an incentive to fish at maximum sustained yield if you can get the collective action problem solved and fish at that level of restriction. Then you actually get about 80, 90% of the total biodiversity in that area at that level, which is a pretty good level. So there's not a strict trade-off between biodiversity and yields. They actually, you can get a pretty good biodiversity at really good sustainable yield. So that becomes sort of the focus on the conservation and management, is to try and get to those points of maximum sustained yield. So we just want to quickly talk about the problem then is a common property problem. And this is an example of work done by Elinor Ostrom, a UCLA graduate in the 1950s who got the Nobel Prize in 2009 and died a few years later. She was kind of that hippie grandma who was not all that excited about private property, private goods and whatnot, and believed that people could organize around common pool resources, and spent a lot of her life trying to figure out how do they do that. And so she was a bit of an outcast in the economics field because she worked on non-private goods, and argued that people were able to avoid the tragedy of the commons by organizing themselves and developing collective action rules. So a lot of her work informs much of the management work that I do. And she has some key points here, what we call key collective action design principles for successful management. And these are points to keep in mind for all of us, which is that if you do want to manage common resources, you have to follow these 8 principles to get anywhere close to managing them without the intervention of strict top-down government or private goods and private property, which are the issues that we face, particularly in the United States these days. But these patterns, these principles, we call them, are existent in any particular group. What you find in particular is that when you get outside of developed countries where we outsource these principles to the government, and therefore we often don't know much about them, when you work in communities that don't have strong central governments, they have these principles in their communities, within their villages. They may be strong and they may be weak, but they have them and they're aware of them because they can't outsource governance to government. You know, what we think of as government. This is governance, but not government. So they have these issues of group identity, cost benefits in terms of engagement, how to get to decision-making in a consensus approach. They, in many cases, monitor, if not resources, often users. They typically have a graduated sanctions approach, which is reminded by the Supreme Court decision today that, you know, what is the appropriate level of sanction? That became one of the key issues. And in our case, we outsource it to the Supreme Court or other courts, but in villages, it's often done at a much local level. Anyways, those things are there, and you can ask yourself how well they're done. And we've done that, and these are communities in East Africa. If you look at people scaling their perceived effectiveness of these principles, in general, you find there are some that are quite strong, you know, particularly decision-making process, group autonomy, conflict resolution among members. Where they do have more problems is conflict resolution with their neighbors. They have more problems monitoring the ecology of resources and more problems with cost benefits. But there are different groups. In general, they cluster into 2 groups, people that are pretty strong in terms of their local governance and some that have weaknesses. And this has important implications because if you have strong governance principles, people are more willing to participate in conservation. When the principles are weak, they're very cynical about the possible outcomes. And that's sort of a lesson for us as well, that if we have strong collective action principles, we can be more secure in making decisions about the commons that concern us, like atmosphere or natural forests and things like that. And the same is true here in East Africa. Another point I'd like to make about commons, because I work in them a lot, is this idea of forums, that one of the key aspects of getting success in commons is to create forums. That is, get people together and talk about the problem. It's just that simple. In the United States, we call that the town hall. That's traditionally what we call the town hall meetings. And those town hall type meetings, they occur all around the world. People do them for various reasons. I stimulate them from the point of view of natural resource management, whereas in many cases they may have more economic focus or whatnot. But one of the things about these forums, there's a couple of weaknesses of them. They're the weaknesses that I see in America in the town hall, but also in the African context that I work, which is they're sort of an enclave forum. Those are what you might call the publicly invited people, the people that seem most interested in these issues. But with any forum that you create, there's what I call the shadow forum. These are people that are outside of the mainstream, as it were. They could be gender, they could be poverty, they could be specific interests. They differ in every single forum, but anytime you engage in commons management, you have to deal with the enclave or the public forum and the shadow forum. And my attempt has always been to try and bring them together. They don't typically want to sit together in the same room. It's particularly hard to get shadow forum people to participate in enclave forums. In some cases, where I work, women tend to not get engaged in public forum as much. They're involved in childcare, et cetera. And sometimes we have basically people that break the laws and they don't want to be involved because they're politically protected. And you can imagine the same occurs in the United States, where you might have strong disagreement on things like climate change. And I don't need to remind you of those things, but it's one of the things that I try and overcome as much as I can. I recognize it and I try and overcome it by trying to make that information as public as possible. How do we do it? I invite people to meetings. This is an example of one, a forum that I have started from 1995, where I bring as many people together. And in that room, there's the bad boys, the good boys, and the managers, and there's quite a variety. Of course, I can't invite everybody. And in fact, the main criticism I get from the forum members is that I need to invite more people, but it has a cost, obviously. And I invite people to discuss my science. Every year I get peer reviewed by fishermen. So almost any peer-reviewed publication that you see that has something to do with fishing has actually been peer-reviewed by this particular group. They've seen the results before I submit, and they tell me what they think about it. And sometimes they have pretty good insights, and sometimes they just nod and tell me that sounds about right. But at least I get peer review from this larger group, and the group in many ways represents a pretty diverse group. In this case, for instance, you can see women participants, which are generally hard to come by in fisheries type forums, but they're involved in the trade, and we make an effort to engage them. And there'll be people in here that are leaders that are on the side of conservation, and there'll be leaders on the side of maximizing wealth today. So they'll all be there in the room. So that's part of how I do that. And it's presenting science, and a lot of times you run into problems. That for instance, the national government has a park creation problem, but what you find is many of these fishermen, they say hatutaki parki, which is a nice alliteration of that we don't like parks. And you realize you're having conflicts between the national government and local communities. And so you have to find ways to intervene here in terms of the options. One of the things that we learned early on about the forums that I mentioned is even in enclave forums, they can be highly biased by who's invited, who chooses to participate, and then the information they come with presented is often biased by their interests. So one of the things I started early to kind of overcome these kind of problems was to do surveys, questionnaires, before we meet. That is, I do random questionnaires in these villages about things they like or dislike. So when we come to talk in a forum, I have a statistical sample of people's opinions about the things we're going to talk to. That changes the dynamics of the forum incredibly, because suddenly people who come with their self-interest or a group interest, they now see a larger statistical representation of that problem. So this would be a typical example where we have problems with these villages down below in terms of what type of restrictions they want to agree to. And you can see they scale these restrictions very differently. Some of them are very in favor of closed areas, and some of them hate them. And so this then, doing the statistical sample where I might have sampled 300 or 400 people here, maybe 20 or 30 people in each of those villages, I now know kind of what they hate and what they don't hate. And then we can move forward by picking restrictions that have some statistical basis. So it's a sort of democracy of the collective based on questionnaires, and less so based on the enclave forum that we create where we make these, where we discuss these issues and make decisions. It leads to a more informed kind of democratic management system, and people are generally pretty happy with it, and it leads us to implement management or restrictions where they're actually desired, and that desired is often based on how effective their governance is. The other issue,
Jambo la muhimu kufahamu uvuvi ni kujua kuna juhudi aina gani inaleta.
the other issue I just wanted to bring up is you need to speak to people in their language. So what I've been creating is just fisheries management ideas that are in the local language, in this case Swahili. I'm starting to post them to my YouTube account. And the idea is just to inform people of what the theory of fisheries management is, in order that they understand what the trade-offs are and what the consequences are of what they do. So this is highly unusual for me to speak in Swahili. In those forums, I give the presentations in Swahili, but then I create these videos to explain my recent findings. It's much like a scientific talk, except that it's addressed at native Swahili speakers, where I should mention the average numbers of years of formal education is about 4 or 5, but they follow this information. It's not a lack of the intelligence to understand it. It's the background, and it's a language problem, and so we have to overcome those issues when we're talking about fisheries management. So you could go to these and listen to me speak about, in this case, about the trade-off between wealth
Kuvua sehemu ambayo
and yield.
hajastuliwa na ni juhudi kidogo kama mtu.
Anyways, that's one of the things. So one of the main things that I work on in many ways is to try and keep this information within a system of enclaves and both shadow and non-shadow forums, in order that we keep this information cycling through a system of monitoring, learning, adjusting, planning, and doing. So I consider that this system itself is really the thing that must last. It's not the information so much, but actually the system of feedback between data collection, communities, responses, outcomes of those responses, reconsidering the plan, doing it, monitoring it, and continuing this cycle. So in many ways, that's what I've been trying to develop within this coral reef African fisheries, in order that we can move in this direction towards achieving both better yields and maintaining biodiversity. I should mention just on closing that as part of my job in the Wildlife Conservation Society is to create these programs around the world. So we have a number, I think it's 10 or 12 programs. This is just the map I had from a few years ago, where people are out collecting field data on coral reefs. All of these areas are undergoing climate change. That's the global ocean temperature in the graph at the top. And all of them are going through human population growth and food security issues. So the hope here is that developed countries like ourselves can provide some of the information to develop this adaptive management system in these poor countries, where some of the principles of adaptive governance are there, but in many cases they're often lacking data to make decisions, and a lot of it is intuitive. And this will also provide information to the status of reefs in terms of climate change. And so I'll stop there. I know I wasn't given a lot of time, but I hope that was useful, understanding myself and some of the work that I do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. That was really fascinating. And I'm definitely going to go look at Mermaid and look at that data because I think it's really important for us to understand what's going on in the part of the world that we can't see. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn it back to Elizabeth and Bryn, and they'll be monitoring the questions, which I see have been coming in through the chat. So thank you so much again. That was fascinating.
Excellent. Elizabeth, do you want me to read the first question from Kaylin?
Sure.
Alrighty. Our first question here is, how much traditional ecological knowledge do you incorporate into your sustainable fisheries or conservation management strategies?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. And I definitely started at that level, in that what I mean by that is that, ask people first. What do they think about things? And so that was part of my training in getting fluent in Swahili, was just spending time talking to people about how they viewed their natural resources and what those views might mean for, say, conservation, or how they may or may not conflict with, say, science as we know it. And so that's that traditional TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, is really a big part of what I do and what I did. I think back 30, 40 years, 30, 35 years ago, that was a key focus. And there's some interesting papers you can read about that. I mean, what the key lessons there are that, people know how to self-govern, but they have strengths and weaknesses like various things. They also have views of life that are this mix of what you could call the physical and metaphysical, where the science deals with the physical, and the metaphysical is not so well dealt with science. And some of the metaphysical may have implications for how people behave, and therefore the consequences for collective action and the consequences for resource management. So in many cases, trying to find that blend between the physical science and the metaphysical views of people has been one of the interesting challenges of working in Africa. It's fascinating for me to try and understand how people view the world, and how it's quite different from the way I look at it from my Western perspective. And yet at the same time, I would say I neither bend either left or right too much on that, because although I'm a scientist and I have to go with my data, I try not to conflict with the metaphysical views that people have, but ask whether or not there's some way to interpret these things in terms of some of their views. So an interesting example just from the talk here is those principles of governance that I outlined, you saw in English. We walked that around with a lot of elders and said, do you have metaphors or idioms that correspond to these principles? And, sure enough, yeah, they do have these idioms or metaphors that correspond to them. So in many cases, when I'm speaking in Swahili, I'll use those idioms and metaphors. And some of them are pretty philosophical, maybe ethereal. Some of them you may not agree with from my cultural background, but we go with them and we see where that takes us. I'm certainly not in the business of converting people to my worldview, but I do like that dialogue and that blending, and I think that's happening. I think that's happening. If you go, the real thing about the forums, that I'm probably the only person who sees this, is they've existed for 30 years. And they started out as pretty conflictual, not so much with me, not so much with science. I think all people could agree that objective information is a useful thing. What they were is conflictual between groups and the way they would interpret data. And I think you can see that in America these days as well. But that same kind of principle would happen. And my job was to be the broker, what I would call the honest broker, that this is the information and let's talk about it. And they were very conflictual in the beginning. Some were violent, some got near physical. And over time, they've become very peaceful events, very looked forward to. People love to come to them. My main job is to find the budget to get as many people in the room as I can, which is always a problem. But people love them because they get this open dialogue, the open forum. They get some objective information. They get the entertaining aspect of this tall blonde white man speaking Swahili for 4 hours. So it's an event, you know. In fact, COVID has been a serious problem because we can't have these big meetings anymore. So that's why I started to go to YouTube and videoing my talks, is that some of those I'm now spreading without the COVID restriction issues that just ended a few months ago in Kenya. So yeah, it's an interesting question. I could go on that issue for forever. It's fascinating. But I guess my main point is I really try and blend, you know, as much as I can, and don't take too strong positions. I mean, a good scientist, as you know, is not dogmatic about his science. So I embody that principle that I could be wrong. And so when I interact with people that have somewhat different views and maybe what seem metaphysical views to me, I enter it with the same humility. But if I do have evidence to the contrary, I won't stop from presenting it. You know, so that leads to the interesting dialogue.
Thank you. David, I was going to ask your question next about the governance structure of the commons. Who's responsible?
Yeah, well, one of the interesting things that I alluded to was that in countries like America and Europe, and even in the region I study in particularly Mauritius and Seychelles and Reunion, these islands with strong governments, all of them, if you go to communities, they don't really even understand the questions. They're like, huh? Well, just ask the government about that. They've outsourced. They are what you would call a society. And in a society, governance is outsourced to the government. However, that evolved out of communities. You know, we love the word community in America, but we are not a community, by the way, just so you know. A community is what I showed you in the first slide. Those are a group of people that live together, that share a common resource, and they have to interact with one another on a daily basis to manage a resource. That's very different from a society, which is jobs are partitioned into specializations. So we outsource governance. So when you go to a community, which is most of the African coastline, and Kenya is sort of transitional, by the way, then they understand those questions. They understand what I meant by group identity. They understand what I mean by polycentric governance. That means that they have to have connections with their neighbors who govern things as well. So it's interesting how different that view is. And yet, I think one point I'm trying to make to you is some of those community aspects are really important, and we sort of forgotten them as we specialize and outsource them to other people, and that leaves us vulnerable to not managing the commons well. That leaves us vulnerable to weak collective action and poor management of commons. So you can see that occurring as you know, capitalism and industry and markets and government colonized decision making in these wealthy countries. So I've probably forgotten the question.
I think you've answered it. Bryn, do you want to?
Absolutely. We can read Michael's question next, which is, what is the difference between a closed area and a protected area?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of language around all those things. It's very confusing. And by the way, it changes from one language to the next, and it changes from even within the scientific discipline. You know, some people like the word no take, some like the word fisheries closure, some use the word marine reserve. Those all mean the same thing. They all mean you can't fish permanently, and that leads to a lot of confusion, because you hear you know, the word protection. We protected this, we protected that. Well, what do you mean by that? You know, we have all these protected areas in California, but dogs and cats are running around in them. Is that protection? I mean, I guess in some way. You're not cutting the trees down, but all of these things have their gradients. And that's why in that one slide I showed sort of the options, you know, from temporary closures to permanent closures to restricted gear so there are about if you look at fisheries, there are you know, just a few options. That's closures in space, closures in time, closures of species, and closures in sexual reproduction when you capture an animal. So you have these limits, and the way they're blended in these different words is very culturally specific. I guess the interesting one there was that I learned something from when I put the word up, the phrase hatutaki paki, which means we don't want a park. And then I thought, paki, why are they using the English for this word? And I asked, is there a word for what you call parki? No, parki is something the government creates in Kenya. Do you think traditionally that people had something that had a similar function? Oh yeah, we had something. What did you call it? Tengefu. From the verb to hold, to kutenga is to hold something, like to put something on a leash, I guess is the way I would. You tenga a goat, you tenga a dog, you put them on a leash. So I said a tengefu, a place that you set aside, you hold it for a while. Yeah, that's what we had, tengefu, but nobody knows that word anymore, and it's lost. I said, what if we created tengefus instead of parks? Oh yeah, that's a great idea. So we don't talk about paki anymore. We talk about tengefu, and as soon as I started using the word tengefu, it became part of the common language. Now everybody knows what a tengefu is. It was a word that died historically, but has now been resurrected through this traditional ecological knowledge. And then there's no conflict. Everybody wants a tengefu now, but they didn't want a paki because it wasn't the word, it was who's associated with the activity. One is an activity done by foreigners or a central government, and another is done at the community level through the engagement with people. So we've created, last count, about 21 tengefus in Kenya as a result of changing a word. Now they're very different because to have a big park, say 10 square kilometers, 20, is very different from a tengefu. A tengefu is more like a small area, and they're not really ecologically that effective. So one of the things we're working on now is how do you make this tengefu actually work ecologically? Some work, some don't. There's like a 50-50 chance of failure or success. And even the successful ones have their limitations because they're not at the scale of national planning. They're at a scale of community planning. So you end up with very different outcomes in these two different areas. But it's an interesting case where language is important. You know, where I've always been a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, Shakespeare. That would be my kind of view of language. But I realize that in social situations, governance, these language word choices are connected to not just they're connected to a whole set of concepts and into relationships. And that, and they can get lost. And then they can get regained when they're needed. And that's kind of an interesting case study of that.
Our next question is from Scott Cooper. I don't want to put you on the spot, Scott, but you were one of our last faculty. Were you a visiting faculty or study center director there in Nairobi? Did you want to say hi, and then maybe you could read your question? Or
Sure. Yeah, I was the study center director in Nairobi from 1989 to 1991. My predecessor was Elijah Lovejoy, and he was also my successor. So, and I've also written the rivers chapters for Tim's book on conservation biology of East Africa. So I'm quite aware of all this. I don't see any of my students here, so I'm just a little disappointed, but there you go.
Well, Scott, finally glad to meet you after 40 years or whatever.
Yes.
And we actually worked together. And it's funny, they asked me, do you know Scott Cooper? I said, that sounds very familiar. And we wrote a book together I think published in 1994. And I never met him physically.
Do you want to ask your question, Scott, or?
I can. It was just, it's actually on behalf of a graduate student that I've been mentoring, but they're trying to look at the relationship between stakeholder diversity and planning, say for an MPA, and the success then of subsequent management or preservation efforts. So I was just wondering if you knew of any studies that looked at the relationship between stakeholder diversity and the success of restoration efforts.
Yeah. I have to put on my thinking cap for a while there. I mean, my initial response to that is, sometimes diversity can't, we're all pro-diversity in a way, I guess, in the academic world, but in some cases, diversity can create, conflict as well, and especially at these community levels that I work at. If there is some lessons to be learned, well, I wrote a paper in Ecology and Society in 2016 that you can read about diversity of thought, and it's a very big data set. It's quite a complicated analysis, and I'm trying to give you the take-home message here if I can summarize it myself. But it depends what you're talking about in terms of getting things done. If you're trying to, say, restore an ecosystem, or you're trying to instigate some management, there's things that are easy to do, and many people will agree on them. And they're at that, I would call that what I would call the entry level restriction or activity. It generally, when you look across diverse groups of people, they don't conflict on those issues. And those issues, you can get collective action. The problem with them is they're sometimes often weak. They don't have strong trade-offs. They don't have strong impacts. They don't end up as being the optimal, from a natural resource management point of view, solution. They get people to agree, they get them to act. They do not create an extreme amount of conflict. They do create some conflict, by the way. But then as you move into more and more difficult types of activities, that's when that diversity starts to, divide people. And they get to, because some sense the trade-offs very starkly and others don't. And so when people start to sense stark trade-offs, they feel uncomfortable. So, I mean, you can imagine in America, if you're a man working in the oil industry and you hear about climate change, you're sensing the trade-offs much more than if you're a professor of aquatic ecology. So you could end up with a diversity of opinions there that will stop you from agreeing on things. So they're and so that's a clear, I'm just using an American case here, but in fisheries, it's the same thing. And when you look at the hierarchy of restrictions from sort of the entry level restrictions, which I would call gear restrictions, people, eliminating destructive gear, and then you move along that scale to minimum size of fish, to seasonal closures, to temporary spatial closures, to a combination of different things, to full no-take closures with no total permanence. Now you're moving into the direction of where this diversity results in some people feeling that this is too strong a trade-off for them, or the time scale on which the benefits are going to occur are too far in the future for them to be in favor of that, restriction, either whether it's restoring or not having access to something. So that's a very long way of addressing a really important problem. And I spent a lot of time thinking about that. There are two papers, one in 2016 in Fish and Fisheries, and one in Ecology and Society in, I think, 2018. So if you look at my name and look at those two papers, they're complicated papers. They don't get cited a lot, and it's part of what I just said. It's not the conclusions are unsettling, because you can't take, it sort of suggests it's hard. There's no simple thing like, oh, diversity is a wonderful thing, or you need homogeneity to get things done. It's not that simple, and we talk in that simple language these days. But if you empirically evaluate these things, like I did, based on, I think, 2,000 surveys, when I mean 2,000 questionnaires, a more complex, nuanced pattern emerges.
Right. I was very interested in how you blend indigenous and scientific knowledge. And of course, that's a real issue. You always include current stakeholders, but when dealing with indigenous knowledge that was developed historically, there's always the question of, does it have cogency today with a completely changed planet? And so That's a big controversy in California right now about the degree to which science can test indigenous practices, or even if that's acceptable.
Yeah, well, and the other thing, I mean, life has moved on. On a very practical level, there's the gradient between rural and urban. You know, that what you're talking about is knowledge, but there's the reality of people's lives as to whether they're rural or urban people, right? And rural and urban people will have very different views of how to survive. And rural will be more community and urban will be more society. And so it's very hard to mix these two groups together because they have very different ways of surviving and consequently ways of looking at the world. And so any particular, paradigm taken from one and applied to the other is likely to fail. That's a very important point I'm making there, and that helps you resolve a lot of issues. So I actually wrote a paper on that too, which is in Fish and Fisheries last year, where I looked at urban-rural gradients of people's perceptions of fisheries. And there's the strongest pattern is population density and distance from markets. That drives people's perceptions. And it's based on a very large data set that took me 10 years to collect with a group of like 30 people, by the way. It's a massive study. And that rural-urban is important. So one of the things that you have to avoid, in my opinion, is overgeneralizing what happened in the past, which is rural and community, to what happens today, which is society and urban. They are different enough that the metaphors, the cognitions, the values are sufficiently different that you can't actually transfer that, cognitive technology, if you want to use that word, from one place to the next. So my argument in that paper is that stop doing it. You need to look at the context of which you are in and not have these philosophical or, debates about which is better, traditional knowledge or science or whatnot. You have to look at the context in which people are operating and then develop things that work. In a society like we live in, we can't really do community-based management. It's just not. You might be able to donate a couple of hours a week, right, to go and do something in your community, but basically you're not a day-to-day guy who's going to be out there managing a community resource. So that's just a simple example of that kind of problem.
Yeah, I'll let the discussion move on so other people can ask discussions. But I just wanted to say that your comments have considerable generality because I'm part of a working group that's looking at the potential for reintroducing grizzly bears to California. We run into all the same problems of urban-rural divides, the people on the land versus the urban environments and so on. So I think your comments have a lot of generality.
Well, read those 3 papers and get back to me. The Fish and Fisheries 2016, the 2018 Ecology and Society, and the Urban 120. That's me doing exactly that for the last 20 years and me coming to my conclusions, which I briefly summarized here. But if you're doing this, you'll appreciate the depth of what I did in that work, which was quite an undertaking. You'll appreciate what you read it. Yeah.
Nima Farai, Sana Kukatana na Wewe.
Asante sana, ata mimi.
We are officially sort of at our time, but I welcome everyone to sort of stick around if you're available. Tim, are you available to stick around for a few more minutes?